Hello, everyone, and welcome to Seeds of Hope, Regenerative Agriculture with Elena Garitas. I'm your host, and this is episode number 10. On this podcast, join me on a journey across the regenerative agriculture ecosystem through conversations with farmers, founders, investors, and changemakers as we discover what it takes to create healthier soils, communities, and food. Behind every regenerative farming success story is a deeper understanding of what makes soil truly healthy. Today's guest is at the forefront of the scientific research that's transforming how we measure, improve, and talk about soil health across North America. Dr. Wayne Honeycutt, President and CEO of the Soil Health Institute, has been leading the Institute's programs to safeguard and enhance the vitality and productivity of soils for the past 9 years. Wayne brings invaluable expertise from his experience as Deputy Chief for Science and Technology with the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service in Washington, D.C., and his earlier roles as both a soil scientist and research leader for the USDA Agricultural Research Service. What I find particularly fascinating about our discussion is how Wayne and his team are bridging the gap between complex soil science and practical farm applications. As Wayne notes, when they first started the Institute in 2015, not many people even used the term soil health. Now, it's become a business imperative for major food companies. We'll explore their groundbreaking soil health benchmarking project, which has already established benchmarks on over 7 million acres, showing farmers exactly what's possible for their specific soil types in terms of soil health. Much like when Roger Bannister broke the 4-minute mile barrier in 1954, proving what was once thought impossible can enable other people to achieve it. This data-driven approach has allowed the Soil Health Institute to provide over 500 farmers with personalized reports showing them how much healthier their soil can become, how much more water it can store, and how to enhance nutrient availability, which creates tangible goals that drives adoption of regenerative practices. We'll also discuss their extensive research involving hundreds of farmers and innovative mentorship programs that are changing how we understand the soil's potential. One last note before we begin. The Regenerative Agriculture Summit is happening in just 3 short weeks in Chicago from the 25th to 27th of March. As you might know, Seeds of Hope is the official podcast partner, and we will be there with a booth. This summit is the only summit that brings together food and textile leaders from across the supply chain. So if you want to join me and 500 other supply chain innovators for 3 days of discussions and actionable strategies, you can use the code SOH for 10% off your conference registration. I hope to see you there. Now, let's get started with my conversation with Wayne. Enjoy. Good morning. Hi, Wayne. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you today?
I'm great. It's a beautiful day here in Miami, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. You're the president of the Soil Health Institute. And so to kick us off, I'd love to hear from you. Do you have a definition of soil health? How would you describe it to someone who doesn't know what it is?
Yeah. Well, there is a kind of an accepted definition of it, but I also admit it sounds a bit academic. It's generally people consider it the definition of the continuous capacity of a soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that sustains plants, animals, and humans. And so you can imagine why I said that does sound a bit academic, but I think the bottom line for us is we look at soil health and evaluate soil health and how well it is functioning compared to how well it could function. And so in really kind of practical terms, the functions we're talking about are things like cycling water or cycling carbon or cycling nutrients. So for example, when you get a heavy rain, does that rain infiltrate into the soil So it's there to replenish the subsoil with moisture and for when the next like drought comes along, or is that water going to run off? And now, deprive that landowner of that replenished moisture. Not only that, but now take nutrients with it down to the waterways, and now where it becomes a contaminant. And so that's kind of a real kind of practical. The way that we look at it is, how well it's functioning and compared to how well it could function. And the beauty of soil health is that we can change it through management. And so we can manage it to improve, whether that water will infiltrate versus run off.
That's
That help?
interesting. Yes, thank you for that. I love that you brought in an example from the water cycle. We just had
Mm,
another guest on the podcast where we talked a lot about water infiltration and the water cycle. And I love sometimes comparing this also to human health, where we have all these interconnected systems happening, and we have
yeah.
bacteria in our bodies, and so does the soil. The soil has
Yeah.
incredible amounts of organisms that work to make it function in the ways you just explained. So I
Yeah.
like that definition.
Good, good. Yeah, the relationship between human health is really quite cool too. And so, it's like one of the things is that you would have like it's kind of contextual too. And it's like human health is a holistic concept, so is soil health a holistic concept. There's many different components, chemical, biological, physical. Um, and so soils, like humans, let's say for a human, you might not have the same health expectation for a 16-year-old as you would have for a 60-year-old. And it's the same way with soils. Some soils are more highly weathered than
Mm.
others, kind of like humans are more highly weathered than others. And so you would have different expectations of what that health might be in that soil. So that's one of the reasons that we do things at the Institute that's real, kind of really locally focused.
And I'd love to get back to what you do at the Institute. But before that, just a clarifying question out of curiosity. So, does the health of, or the change of human health over time parallel with the change of soil health? Is it physical years that determine the health of soil, or maybe the ways that they've been managed? What ages soil, so to say?
Yeah, yeah. It is a combination of things, and it's not so much the just time, just duration, but it's things like how it was managed during that time and what the role of climate was. And like, if it's in a very, hot climate where plants are not growing a lot, then you're not going to have much organic matter into it. And there's all these different kind of interactions with it. So it's not just time, but it's what the scientists refer to as pedogenic time, meaning how that soil has developed. So it's all depending on things like the parent material that it forms from, the climate that it's in, the topographic position, and how it's managed on top of that. I know I'm probably getting down into the weeds too much, but the bottom line is that it really is contextual. And so that's one of the reasons why we focus on kind of that local level, what those local soils are, and make our interpretations of soil health in relationship to those local soils, that local environment that they formed in. We refer to them as inherent properties, and then there's the managed properties on top of that.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's very important, because a lot of times this conversation around soil health, or even specifically regenerative agriculture, can be had in broad strokes. But as you said, looking at the local context is incredibly important.
Yeah,
So I could imagine that the soil down here in Miami, for example, which is vastly different than, let's say, soil in the Midwest or even in North Carolina,
right.
where you are, might not be less or more healthy if you compare one to the other. But if you compare different soils inside the context,
Yeah,
you might see some
yeah,
differences.
yeah, that's right. I mean, basically, most soils can be healthy. And so it's hard to compare across soils, but within a given soil type, you can manage it in a way to where it's functioning more optimally. And so that's the basic premise of it. Just to your example, We don't really want to compare like a silt loam in Texas to a silt loam in Iowa just because they are silt loams. They have different inherent properties beyond just being a silt loam and different, climates and things like that. And so, but we can optimize the health of those in the silt loam in Texas and the silt loam in Iowa. We just don't want to compare them and think they should reach the same level as one another because they're very inherently different soils.
That makes sense. And this is, I promise, the last question on this
Yeah, it's all
detailed
good.
exploration. But so, can you give some examples, or what are the inherent properties that you look for in a soil?
Yeah, it's interesting you asked that because one of our projects is grouping similar soils together so that we can establish how healthy that group of soils can get. That way we look at some of those similar properties that are really important. And like one of them is drainage. Is it really well drained? Is it poorly drained? Another one is things like the acidity. Is it really acidic or not? Another is the texture, which means how much sand, silt, and clay it has. And so we use some of those types of inherent properties to help us group soils together because we think that because of those inherent properties, then they will respond to management in a similar way.
Interesting. So maybe I did lie about the last question. Um, so,
Well,
so
I hope I'm not taking you down a long path here, but yeah, please ask.
no, no, no worries. I think this is relevant. Okay, so you mentioned you'll have a group of inherent properties like acidity, and that helps you group different soils and see which ones can be healthier. So are you also looking at outcomes? Like you just mentioned water infiltration, which is more of an outcome of a property, if I understand it
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah, yeah. We actually are. And so it's mostly what we look at is the outcomes in terms of soil health. We have established kind of an essential suite of indicators or measurements for everyone to use. We've established that to be useful and applicable across North America, from Mexico across the U.S. and into Canada. And we think it can be very applicable in many other places too around the world. And so we do use those types of measurements to establish just how healthy soils can get, and then to help monitor their progress. So, yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's a really important context, I think. So you've mentioned a few projects through this conversation. So what does the Soil Health Institute do? You're a research-focused organization, but you also work in education and policy. So could you give us a brief overview of the Soil Health Institute?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are a nonprofit, and so we do work for the public good. We basically focus on conducting and then also translating the science of soil health to benefit both agriculture and the environment. And those two come together quite nicely. It's not like we have to focus on agriculture and then focus on the environment, because when you improve soil health, that it also has those environmental benefits. And there's a lot of examples of that. And so that's a big kind of overall, a broad, brush strokes of what we do. But when we kind of get down into the weeds, we look at things like information that the farmer might need to know, like on the business case, the most effective measurements, some of the tools or resources they may need, and some of our education outreach programs that take that research to put it into the hands of farmers. And we try to also help ensure that policy is informed. And so we don't have like a big policy department or anything, but we also are occasionally asked and try to help inform policies. So, of these benefits for improving soil health for farmers and the environment.
Is there a lobby for soil health that is swaying politicians or is trying to influence
Yeah.
policy?
Um, I would not put it that way. There are individuals and organizations that pretty much under kind of the heading of good agriculture, regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, that, they do try to help inform policymakers of what farmers' needs are. And increasingly, it's recognized that focusing on soil health is one of those rare win-win situations where you can benefit, like the profitability of the farmer and build drought resilience for the farmer and those types of things. And some of those same practices now will improve water quality, improve air quality, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's not like you do not really have to make a stretch to focus on both. If you focus on improving soil health, it brings those environmental benefits along with the on-farm benefits.
Yeah, and you've mentioned now profitability and becoming more resilient as a farm for the farmer. And you've worked through your research with the organization with lots of farmers. When you're thinking about building a business case, what matters most to farmers when they're considering soil health and improving soil health?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I should caveat my answer to say that I'm not a farmer. I used to try to farm, but I was not very good at it, so I had to become a scientist instead. Um, but so I need to caveat it, because I don't want to try to speak for farmers. But in the farmers that I speak with, what I consistently hear is most important to them is that business case. Is it going to increase or reduce their profitability or increase or reduce their economic risk for adopting new practices that are often needed for improving the health of their soils? So that's one of the big ones that often comes up.
And I saw on the website of the Soil Health Institute, some of the research was highlighted, and there was a map of the United States with different locations highlighted of taking multiple farms from a specific area and looking at, okay, what is the business case of corn grown in the Midwest while implementing soil health principles and comparing their, let's see, balance sheets and economic situation to each other. I'm curious, and I don't know if you'll be able to make comparisons between the regions, but what is something that you've discovered or found during this process?
Yeah, there's so many things, and it's just really been enlightening and encouraging in many ways. One is that most all of these farmers that we have interviewed, we purposely went to farmers that had been adopting these soil health improving practices, things like no tillage and cover crops. Many of them also adding manure, those types of things. One of the things, like this one project across 9 Midwest states where we interviewed 100 farmers, is we found 85% of them increased their profitability by using these soil health improving practices. And a lot of that comes from reducing inputs, like over 80% of them reduced their fertilizer inputs. And that just makes so much sense when we look at the science, because the science shows us that when you increase organic matter in your soil from these same practices, that part of that organic matter includes things like nitrogen and phosphorus. And when you grow things like cover crops, then now those cover crops that are growing in the fall, winter, spring, they are now extracting some of the nutrients and bringing them back to the surface so that they're not leached out of the soil profile. And so that also allows farmers to reduce, some of their fertilizer requirements. And so it's really nice to see from interviewing those 100 farmers where over 80% of them said, hey, that we were able to reduce our fertilizer inputs. And so it's one of those things that is just kind of very reassuring, because it's where the on the farm reality really verifies what the scientific research shows. That happens in that particular project showed that many times over. Another situation was, we know by building organic matter increases the actual capacity of a soil to hold water. And 97% of those farmers said improving soil health and following these practices helped them build resilience to things like drought and heavy precipitation. And so again, it's like, yeah, we have this research graph that shows this, and now we interview farmers, and they're giving us basically all the validating information, that just verifies, what the science shows. But I would just say another thing that was also really, really clear, and we knew this going in, and it was really validated, was that every farm is different. And that is why it's so important and was important for us and important for our future work to not just be interviewing one or two or 5 or 6 or 10 farmers. That one project had 100 farms across 9 states. And so we covered, ranges of precipitation and soils and stuff. Every farm is different. And there were, I said 85% increased profitability. Well, guess what? About 15% did not. Some of them lost a little money.
Right.
Yeah, right. And so that's just another reason why when you're doing this type of work on the business case, it's really important to know that every farm is different. And, with their age of machinery, with, their soils, their climate, all these different things that can make an impact on the results.
For sure. And you mentioned that building organic matter in the soil increases resilience against droughts, for instance. And then you also talked about the profitability. So one other thing that I've heard a lot about transitioning when you have maybe not taken any action to improve your soil health in the past, and now you want to include practices to improve soil health, build carbon, grow cover crops, etc. There is that transition period which might carry some risk, both financial risk and investment, as well as just introducing change into a system creates less stability, let's say. So I'm wondering, either have you found anything about trends that make farmers successful in these transition periods, and is there something that the Institute does to support farmers through this transition?
Great question. Really, really great question. Yes. What we hear from farmers is that initially most people were just focused on, hey, there's some biological reason for like a decline in yield when you're transitioning. But there are other farmers that say, well, that's not really a biological decline. It's more of a learning curve of learning some new practice. And little things can make a difference when you're farming. And so one of the things, and I'll just point out things like the depth of seed placement and the row spacing and things like that. Sometimes they tweak in order to optimize their management. And so one of the things that we do at the Institute is, for example, right now we not only have like 9 soil health educators spread across the country and one in Canada working with farmers, farm groups, number of different organizations, but that we also give a modest stipend. Right now we have, I think, 12 farmer mentors. So these are farmers, full-time farmers that are already successful at adopting these practices. And so we give them a modest stipend to be a mentor to other local farmers. And we work with them like to host a field day on their farm. And so that way other farmers are hearing from a farmer. We give the microphone to the farmer to talk. We might, offer some opening comments or whatever, but we largely look at farmers needing to hear from other farmers and that have experienced that change. That's one of the things that we really focus on with our education program is to help through that transition period with the knowledge that other farmers have experienced. For example, some farmer is getting ready to start. Well, now the spring is wetter than normal. And so they don't have to go through as much trial and error. Now they can pick up the phone and call the mentor, say, hey, it's a lot wetter this spring. What do you recommend? And so it can help them through that transition period. And another thing we do is we give a modest stipend to local technical specialists that are already there that can talk to them about things like, oh, this cover crop needs to be planted in this zone or this climate zone by such and such date, or it needs to be terminated by such and such date, and it should be seeded, by a certain rate. And so a lot of those nuances. And just one more point about that is like what is really reassuring and kind of inspirational really is when we have like workshops for farmers and we have our farmer mentors talking to them. The second most popular stop on the field day is digging a soil pit and looking at the soil.
Hmm.
But the first is hanging around in the tool shed and listening to the farmers about and looking at their equipment that they're using and listening to their experiences on how they needed to adjust that equipment and how they've learned to optimize it. That's still, I wanted to make sure I made that point with you too, because I think that that's such an important part of understanding that transition period that you're asking about, that it might not just be like a biological yield drag, but it's maybe an information gap that we can really kind of help using like our farmer mentors and other farmers, to share with others, what they've done when they made that transition.
Yeah, so you're providing to them both the scientific data and also the experience through those mentorship programs of other farmers who've done this on their own farm for maybe a few years.
Yeah.
That's incredibly valuable, and that also falls in line with what I understand to be one of the pillars of the work that you do, which is not just doing the scientific research, which is already a huge part of the puzzle, but translating it to make it accessible for farmers and other non-scientific people like policymakers. I find that even in soil health or regenerative agriculture, which is all about an ecosystem, we're still relatively siloed. I'm curious, do you have a methodology that you use to make scientific knowledge more accessible and practical for people like farmers or other types of decision makers?
Yeah. Well, certainly a big part of it is what I just described with helping provide to farmers kind of the expertise of other local farmers. But we also really focus on providing tools and resources as part of those education programs. Some of our resources, for example, would be not just have a more technical document describing the business case, but having a 1-page or 2-page fact sheet on the business case. We also try to take some of the scientific information, and I'm not downplaying the science because we need to make sure it's scientifically credible. And so we do that, and our scientists will publish in the peer-reviewed scientific journals, but that's not our end game. Things don't stop there, because we even take like the scientific abstract of an article and now rewrite it into what we refer to as an interpretive summary, so that folks that don't have a strong technical background will also understand the importance of it, what was done, what they found out, and what, the implications of those findings are. And so we provide those types of summaries. And then another thing that we've done is we try to look for ways that really will increase adoption of, like, for example, the best measurements to use. And so we found that many measurements, we evaluate over 30 measurements across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, soil health measurements, to identify the most effective ones. So then we look through the additional filter of, well, how costly is it? Is it something that requires a laboratory, or can it be done in the field? And does only one lab do this, or can many labs do this? And so we boiled it down to only recommending 3 that people can use. And so that makes it more cost effective. There's a 4th one that's important, but it can be predicted with equations. And one of those that we're recommending now can be done on your phone.
That's convenient.
Yeah, it's really convenient. And so we worked with the university in Australia, University of Sydney, to improve and release an app that's free. And so farmers, anyone can do it, like at their kitchen table or their pickup truck or wherever. And so
What's the name of this app?
It's called Slakes, Slakes.
All right, Slakes. I'll put it in the show notes. And I'm
All
also
right.
curious where people can find the other resources that you mentioned, like the videos,
Yeah,
the fact sheets, the science interpretation.
absolutely. Yeah, all these things are on our website. You can do searches for resources, but you can also go right to the initiatives and dig a little bit deeper and find them there. And And if people have a hard time finding it, I always welcome email to ask me. It's Honeycutt, WHONEYCUTT at soilhealthinstitute.org. That's all one word, Soil Health Institute. And it's easy to miss a couple of letters when you're typing such a long thing, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with the audience. I'm sure people will find that helpful. I wanted to touch on the fact sheets that you mentioned, just to close the loop on the business case conversation. So you said that you've surveyed 100 farmers in the Midwest alone and also in other places in the US, and you found that 85% had improved profitability. Was most of that data qualitative, or were you also able to gather quantitative data about the amount of decrease in costs due to decrease of inputs or increase in profits?
Yeah.
Is that part of the fact sheet?
Yes, that's a really good question. I would consider it kind of a blend of qualitative and quantitative, because you can imagine if anyone asked you or me, can you show me the receipts of all of your transactions for the last 20 years? We were like, no. And so we were not going to farmers and saying, please show us all your books, all your receipts. I mean, if we had done that, we would have gone from probably 100 farmers in our study to one or two. And every farmer's different. We don't want to do that. And so instead, our economists, we have a PhD economist on staff, and it's a process that he's used at a university before he came to us, an extension service of university before he came to us. And it's quite well documented that people do this. And it more involves an interview with a farmer. Tell me about, your practices. What tillage practices do you use? Oh, you use no-till. Okay, well, when did you start? Well, if you were not doing no-till, what would you be doing? Or what were you doing before you used no-till? And they might be saying well, I was moldboard plowing. And so then at that point, now the economist can look at standardized tables for the cost per acre of no-tillage versus the cost per acre of moldboard plowing, and how much fuel is used on one versus the other, and things like that. And so that's really how the analysis of the economics was done. So it's kind of a mixture of qualitative and quantitative, but it's standardized to kind of prices at a given year and stuff like that. Did that help?
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting. So you're inferring some of the costs, you have cost assumptions or profit assumptions based on other research and data that you have access to.
Yeah, that's right.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about something more current that's happening. So you have a lot of programs that you're running educational programs, science, and everything in between, which is, as a nonprofit, reliant on funding. And there's been some uncertainty recently about the future of research funding. And I'm curious to hear, from your perspective, leading a research and science-led organization, how are you navigating this?
Yeah. So today is February 6th. And so there have been some uncertainties regarding federal funding in the recent weeks. And so I think a primary focus for us in that navigation of that space is to try to help everyone understand that improving soil health benefits farmers and the environment. And so it is one of those rare win-win situations where it helps farmers not only by building drought resilience, reducing inputs, increasing profitability, but also it benefits the environment by improving water quality and not losing as many nutrients through leaching and runoff. And so our approach is basically to try to help ensure that individuals are well informed, and so that they see this is not in any way, shape, or form a partisan issue. It is an issue for ensuring food security. It's an issue for, ensuring a clean environment, stable climate, improving, water quality, air quality, but in ways it's also really good for farmers and help keep them on the land. And we need them on the land. We need them to be managing these landscapes. And so there are ways now with improving soil health that they are not only managing them that helps build their drought resilience or their resilience to extreme weather in any way, like heavy rain, that helps them build that resilience to things like soil-borne pathogens and stuff like that. It helps them reduce their input costs, but that also, helps them improve water quality. These other environmental benefits. And so that's basically our approach, is that we recognize this is not a partisan issue at all. It is it's a human global ecosystem, issue, and that can really benefit, food security for all too.
Yes, I'm hearing it's an issue for public health, for, of course, our farmer, our food security, which is some of the top most important priorities, of course, of a government or a community. And do you see there to be a incentive or a greater shift for nonprofits to more private capital or partnerships with private companies in anticipation of maybe unknowns in the future
Yeah,
from government funding, let's say?
it seems I think it's probably a little early to kind of read in the crystal ball, but I'll share with you that that's something that, we are thinking more about at the Soil Health Institute, and I know at least a couple of other nonprofits are also, is that, if the bottom line is we all really are deeply passionate about our work. And so if one funding source seems to start to go away, then we need to focus in on some other funding sources too, because the work is needed. And I'm sure a lot of people have never heard the term soil health or know what it is, but that does not make it any less important for them, for the world, for the future. And so there are a number of organizations, nonprofits like us, that are just deeply committed and passionate about it. You know, so sure, it's incumbent upon us to look for a diversity of funding sources to allow us to keep us doing this good work for that future of the planet and all of its inhabitants. And I guess when I say inhabitants, I'm not just talking about the two-legged variety. I'm talking about all the other animals and other creatures that we share this earth with.
Yes. So I love what you said about the passion that you and your team bring to the table and the type of work that you do. And you're nestled in between this really powerful space of research and practical applications. So I'm curious, what role do you see nonprofits like the Soil Health Institute play in the transition in general? Why do we need to keep funding and keep doing the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it is that independent nature that for doing work for the public good that nonprofits have at their core, most all of them. And so that's a big part of the answer. But I have to also share with you that I recently had an internal week-long workshop with our leaders and our program directors from across the country. They all came into our headquarters office here in North Carolina, and we spent a week together looking at, things are internal processes. What do we need to improve upon? It's like any organization does probably at least annually. But I started off by asking them, saying, I would like for us just to go around the room and just talk about what was it that brought you to the Soil Health Institute. And it was quite amazing just how many of them talked about their passion for the work and the opportunity working here at the Institute gives them to have impact at scale. And so we know we do things that's really locally relevant, but we also do it by looking at broader principles that allow us to apply it in a much bigger scale. And so these are people that are just really passionate about improving things for farmers, but also improving things for the environment. And that was just a real consistent thread. And I have to think that we are not alone. I have to think that so many of the nonprofits that are working in this space are equally as passionate about it and wanting to have that type of benefit, not just for current generations, but for future generations. It's
Building a legacy.
yeah, yeah, and just you know, I'm obviously a bit further in my career than you are. uh, uh, I'm older, and I would put it this way. The older you get, the more you realize how much you owe to those who came before you. And that means you have a responsibility for those who are coming after you. And so I think that's one of the things that just really carries through with so many of us working in the nonprofit space. We know that we're temporary stewards of the earth, and we know that if we can put our passions for helping prepare it for those that come after us, whether we're thinking about that on a daily basis or not, I think the bottom line that is one of those things that eventually people come to as they get older, is they realize what is meaningful to them in their work. And I think that's what drives so many people in this nonprofit space, is that how it gives their life meaning, and that that they may not think too much about the future when they're early career or mid-career, but as you get on, you realize that's why it's giving you so much meaning, and why you want to continue it on, and do everything you can to help prepare the ground for the next people that come.
And I think it also comes with this awareness that we're part of a system. Our actions are interconnected with, as you said, not just the two-legged inhabitants of this world, so birds. No, I'm just joking. Humans.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And I think one thing that really stood out to me, I heard a while back, was imagining your kids in the future asking, so what did you do to, help improve the environment and help our relationship with the earth, and also the sustainability of the human race ultimately, and many other species.
Yeah.
So that really, I think, touches a deep chord inside us as humans.
Yes, I think so. And I, getting back to your question, I think it's one of those prevalent characteristics of those of us that choose to dedicate our time working in nonprofits in this conservation space. And I guess I want to reemphasize that it's not just about the environment. It's also about humans and the wildlife that we share the earth with, and all those things too. But it's not a us versus them issue.
Yes. I also would love, if you want to, for you to share some of the impact that the Soil Health Institute has had over, let's say, the last 5-10 years. What are some things that you're proud of your organization for, that you've accomplished together?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess kind of the bigger picture, and it's not just us. There's a lot of people in this space, making a lot of progress. But when we first started the Institute in late 2015, I was the first hire in 2016, there were not a lot of people that even used the term soil health. And so now I feel like that it has advanced to where more people are recognizing that as that win-win opportunity for farmers and the environment, for agriculture. The former vice president and chief sustainability officer for General Mills, heard him say one time that soil health was a business imperative for General Mills. And so that's one of those, I think, kind of realizations that I feel like we've had a role in helping steward and spark. And so that's kind of the big picture. When you get down to some of the real specifics, there have been so many impacts I think that our folks have made. One was when we first started this, you would get 10 soil scientists in the room, and you would come up with 11 different opinions of how to measure soil health. And so we tried to answer that for everyone. And we said, okay, what all affects what your answer is going to be? Well, it depends on the different soil, the different climate, depends on all these different measurements. And so we set out, got a large grant, to evaluate over 30 different soil health measurements across Mexico, U.S., Canada, and Canada, where at each of these sites, they had a replicated experimental design. So they had the appropriate experimental design to allow us to come to the appropriate statistical conclusion about the effectiveness of each measurement. And so each of these projects or studies were comparing some type of conventional system with a soil health improving system. So we crossed all these different soils, different climates, different production systems, different management practices, and sampled these soils all the same way. Given analysis, was all done in the same lab. And, we sampled them 90+% of them all at the same time of year between spring, thaw, and planting. And so it was just a heck of a, Herculean effort. But we did it to try to reduce a lot of the noise and in the data. And it really was quite amazing, a big project, thousands of samples. And so then we analyzed it, found out what the most effective measurements were, and then we boiled it down, filtered it down to the ones that we could recommend for everyone to use. And so one of the big accomplishments is that now not only does North America have this credible analysis of all these different measurements and a recommendation of which ones to use, but it's backed up by scientific journal publications in eight journal publications.
Wow.
Two of them actually just last year were nominated for Paper of the Year by the Soil Science Society of America Journal.
Incredible.
And USDA's NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, they provide financial assistance to farmers. And so they are now, starting this last year, providing financial assistance for farmers to use these recommended measurements in all 50 states. And so I think that's a pretty good accomplishment.
Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah.
And I think there's definitely a lot of overwhelm around all these different ways to measure, around all these different ways to basically validate what you're doing, especially as big brands like General Mills, Pepsi, McCain are looking into transitioning their supply chains and sourcing from farmers that are improving soil health. That is a really critical component. And I love that it now is becoming activated and there's funding behind farmers implementing these research findings of measuring their soil health.
Yeah.
So kudos. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Yeah, I'm really excited. Hope it didn't sound like bragging. It's a lot of work, and there's several other good impacts, but that's kind of the first one that jumps to mind. Yeah.
Yes, I can imagine we could probably do another half an hour or hour if we talk about all the other amazing work that you do at the Institute with your team. But as we wrap up our conversation, is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience today?
I think probably I've mostly covered it. One thing I would just thinking of, just kind of, I've made the point that I really wanted to make, that, although there's some uncertainty in our times with funding right now, this is not a partisan issue. These practices, even though they might have headings like climate smart or something like that in them, they're not a partisan issue. They're really beneficial for farmers. And so that's kind of one point. Another is that soil health really is that foundation for regenerative agriculture, because that's really what we're doing when we're improving soil health, is we are regenerating the soils. And so I do not see any difference between soil health and regenerative agriculture. They're right there together. I just don't see them being separate. And then the last point that I would make I just tell you just a little, just very, very briefly about something that we're working on now that just is really exciting. And that is soil health benchmarks. And so our situation is that the farmers have been farming their land for generations. They may not realize just how healthy it can become, because a lot of times they've been tilling it, for decades. And so they don't realize that, that how degraded it's become and how much healthier it can become. And so we've developed a process called soil health benchmarks, where we go to sites for a given soil group and we establish how healthy that soil can become. Different soils have different capacities. And so then that allows us now to interpret and show farmers, okay, this is where you are, but this is how healthy your soil can become. And this is how much more water it can store. And this is how you can enhance nutrient availability. And they were even all working on something where we can show them on a 30-year average, this is how much more water your soil could expect to soil and could expect to store in the month of May, June, and July, things like that. And so this soil health benchmarking process, it sounds a bit academic, but now we have proven it out. We've established these benchmarks on over 7 million acres in 2023. And I think we're going to be at about 5 or 6 million in 2024. I haven't seen the final results yet from 2024. And so we've really gone beyond the proof of concept now. And now we've developed reports for some 500 farmers showing them where their soil is and how much healthier it can become. So this is like a new piece of information that people haven't had. Is my point. It's like, if they're just farming, they're making a decent yield, making a decent profit, they may not realize just how much better it can get. And so now we think we can show them that, so that we think this can be another great driver for adopting these practices that benefit, again, not only the farm, but also the environment for the rest of society.
So you're creating almost a goal, or showing people what is possible and what is it that you're really working towards.
Yeah, that's
or
right.
what is it that you're funding, or what is it that you're advocating. Something tangible that people can look at. That's incredible. I can't wait to see that report.
That's right. When you think of things like when they first started, like the fertilizer industry, a lot of it really took off after World War II, when they took those munition plants and then they reworked them to making fertilizer, and they put out test plots to show farmers, you add 50 pounds of nitrogen, here's your corn, 75, here's your corn, 100, here's your corn. And so it showed farmers what was possible. And so this is one of those next things we think in the soil health movement, is to show farmers what's possible with improving soil health, how much more water they can store, for example.
That reminds me also of the 3-minute mile, I believe. Oh no, the 4-minute mile. It reminds me of the 4-minute mile.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was thought to be impossible to run a mile under 4 minutes, and then finally, I believe Roger Bannister did it, and after he successfully ran the mile under 4 minutes, suddenly there were lots of runners who managed this. And it's that knowing of what is possible and pushing the barriers, or pushing the limits of what is possible as well.
Yeah.
So that's
important.
I
think some of that, I agree, some of that ties back into kind of that whole farmer mentor opportunity, showing people what is possible. You've probably heard the adage, you can, but if you think you can't, you're right. Mm-hmm. And it's those that ties very much into that too, I think. It's like, showing what is possible.
Well, I love this as a note to end our conversation on. That can be applied to all areas of life, and I'm excited to have you and the organization Soil Health Institute as part of this transition, pushing forward the right thing to do for our planet, for other species, for our human health, and all the amazing things we talked about. So thanks for the work you do, and thank you for this conversation and sharing some of that with our audience. I'll link everything we talked about in the show notes so people can find the website, find the work that you do, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much, Wayne.
It's my pleasure. It's my great pleasure to work with the Institute and privilege, and it's really a pleasure visiting with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, it was great having you.
Thank you.
Bye, Wayne.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Seeds of Hope. Our wonderful theme music is composed by Dane Myers. If you enjoyed the show, please follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. Share it with a friend who might find it inspiring. And if you're loving the podcast, we'd be grateful if you could leave a rating and review on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. It really helps others discover us. See you next time, and thanks again.